Now's the time when we turn within to that inner world, that sacred life, our ever indwelling presence of Spirit. This time when we lay aside both the things that are in our hands, the things that are on our minds, those things that are in our hearts. We release the past. We allow the future to wait for a while. And we simply breathe into the presence that is. In this moment, we can be still. As we follow the breath of life into our bodies, breathing deeply in, deeply out. We move into that center of our being, that core, that innermost presence. Our brother and way shower Jesus talked about not praying publicly, but going into private. It's not about show, not about who sees us, not about who hears our words. It's about our connection to what he called Abba, Daddy, what we may call Spirit, Father, Mother, Universe, the all that is. In this inner world, we have a window onto that allness, a connection that sustains us with every breath. We feel that connection. We know that we are part. We are one. In this moment, we find that wholeness, that complete presence that fills every empty space, that heals every incomplete part, that sustains us even in moments when we do not know how we will go on. When we truly leave all that is not this moment behind. When we turn to the Spirit of God, nothing is too much. Everything is possible. And so, for a moment, for a time, we commune with that Spirit of God. We partake of spiritual communion. We eat of that bread of life. We drink of that wine of Spirit as we are one with God in the silence. We find peace in the silence. We find hope in the silence. We find healing in the silence. Very often we find answers to the questions that have been weighing on our minds and our hearts in the silence. And the most important thing is we find ourselves with God in the silence. We're one. We are whole. We are spirit expressing uniquely, individually, preciously. As we return from this sacred space, we bring with us our understanding of our oneness with God, our oneness with all that is, all that has been, and all that is yet to come. We're not separate. We're not alone. And for that, and all the healing that we find in God's presence, we say thank you. Thank you, God. So it is. Yeah, wow. Thanks. So today I'm talking about one of our core values, healing. And there are a lot of ways that I could address healing, particularly to a Unity audience. But today I want to talk about it as a core value of this congregation. So that kind of requires me to go through some very specific mechanics. And the first thing that I want to do is define healing as it is a core value for us. And this is not a definition I got from Webster's dictionary. This came to me. So for us, as a core value, I would define healing as understanding and demonstrating the innate wholeness that is our birthright as children of God. On the off chance any of you are taking notes, I'll say that again. It is understanding and demonstrating, and that's a key, the innate wholeness that is our birthright as children of God. Obviously, healing has a lot to do with taking something that is not well and making it better, and that's kind of the standard definition. One thing I found fascinating as I was doing some of my research is the root of healing, and I may be mispronouncing it, but I believe it's pronounced heil. It's from Old English and Old German. And it's the root of the words heal, hail, as in hale and hearty, and whole. Healing is innately connected to wholeness. Right? And it is through our understanding of the truth of our wholeness that we are, in fact, healed. So the first thing we want to look at, aside from what does healing actually mean, at least what does it mean in this context, is why. Why is healing one of our core values? Why did we pick that? What does that have to do with us? What does that have to do with this church? You know, and for that, there are a couple of simple things we can go to. The first is our principles. You know, the first two of Unity's basic principles. The first one says that there's only one presence and one power in the universe and in our lives, God. Omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. That means God's everywhere in everything, which includes us. You, me, all of us. God is in all of us. So that leads us to our second principle, which says that because God is in all of us, we are not originally sinful, as some church doctrines would have people believe. We are, in fact, originally divine. We are originally whole. We are originally part of God. And so it is that innate wholeness that leads us to knowing that when we're not feeling whole, when we're not demonstrating wholeness, that it's available to us when we do those things that will bring us back into alignment with that wholeness that is already there in every space in this universe, because it's all part of God. Amen? May not feel like that sometimes. The facts may not feel God-like sometimes, but the truth is God is there in all things. So we look at Unity's history. All right. Now, short version of the history of mind healing, scientific Christianity. We tend to date the beginning of this whole movement to a clockmaker from Massachusetts named Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. He became fascinated with the work of the French hypnotist Anton Mesmer. He began doing experiments. He found a particularly good subject, a guy that was really easy to hypnotize. And he worked with this guy off and on. And he discovered that the human mind has power over the human body. Okay, that's the core level truth that he got down to. And because he lived in an era, this is the 1820s, 1830s at this point I'm talking about, because he lived in an era when Western medicine was probably more likely to do harm than good, he thought he'd see if he could apply this to healing people. Could our minds make us healthy? And in fact, he had really spectacular results. He healed thousands of people. He kind of gave up on the clock and watchmaking and became a healer. And he traveled around and people traveled to him. He healed so many people that he eventually wore himself out. He died around 61, 62 years old of exhaustion because he had been healing so many people using these principles, which he eventually wrote about as believing that he had found the same healing technique mastered by Jesus Christ. And when we read how Jesus healed people, he kept telling them, your faith has made you whole. So one of Phineas's patients was a lady named Mary Patterson. When he first met her, she had to actually be carried up the stairs to his office by her husband and some of his friends. He healed her. A marriage or two later, her name was Mary Baker Eddy. Yeah. And she became the founder of Christian Science using the exact same principles that she was taught by Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, although she claims that they were divinely revealed to her. I think that anyone who does their homework understands that it was actually a sort of a passing down of the principles. She also taught many people. Among them was a lady named Emma Curtis Hopkins. Emma left Christian Science, although back then it was more of a generic term until Mary started enforcing the copyright on it. And Emma taught a lot of people, including Ernest Holmes, who founded Divine Science, and Myrtle and Charles Fillmore. Now, Myrtle Fillmore, who was one of the founders of Unity, first heard about this kind of healing from a fellow named E.B. Weeks, who was a student of Emma Curtis Hopkins. She had tuberculosis, which back in those days was a death sentence. She was given 6 months to live, and she was basically willing to try anything. So she goes to this guy's lecture, and what she hears him say is, you are a child of God, and you do not inherit sickness. So she began working with that. She began affirming it. She began talking to the cells in her body, talking to the organs in her body, apologizing for ever thinking anything less of them than complete health and wholeness, affirming the life running through every part of her body. And within 2 years, she was completely healed. No tuberculosis. So she began studying with Emma Curtis Hopkins and eventually became ordained. Her husband, Charles, saw what was going on with her and was fascinated by it, and he began studying it. Charles had, as a younger man, been in a skating accident and had a necrotic hip. And the leg that was attached to that hip had not fully developed. It began close to 6 inches shorter than his other leg. By the time he passed at the age of 94, his legs were only about a half an inch different in length. So while it took him quite a long time, he actually managed to regrow his leg using these principles. So the two founders of Unity both personally, very deeply personally, experienced the power of healing that we have. Charles wrote about it in almost every book he wrote. He referred to this power that we have as regeneration. And if I were to go into the topic of regeneration, we could be here for a couple of weeks because Charles really went on and on about it. But the bottom line is that as children of God, we do not inherit sickness, not in truth. And if we do happen to run up against a dis-ease, in fact, we have the ability to overcome. We have the ability to overcome. So, having been given that as a modern mandate, we can also look back to Jesus, our way shower. And there are a couple of pieces of the Gospel of Luke I want to read you, because a lot of times when we think about the healing stories of Jesus in the Bible, we think, well, he was different. You know, he was somehow special. And that's what they taught me in the church I grew up in. You know, that there was no way I was ever going to be like Jesus. Right? And somehow that was a story I could just never quite buy. Well, the truth is, Jesus was actually teaching people to do the things that he did. And while, yes, we all know about stories of him healing blind people and healing lepers, casting out demons, one thing that we tend to skip over a lot are these two passages. This first is from the beginning of the 9th chapter of Luke. It says, "Then Jesus called the 12, right, his disciples, together, and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal." And then he kind of gives them some instructions. And it says that they departed and went through the villages, bringing the good news and curing diseases everywhere. So that's the 12 disciples. And we tend to think of them as kind of special people, right? Jesus sent a lot of other people out to do the same thing, people that are just pretty anonymous. Okay, this is, in my Bible, it's entitled The Mission of the 70. All right, so this is Luke chapter 10 at the beginning. It says, "After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs," kind of like the Mormons, I guess, to every town and place where he himself intended to go. And he gives them a bunch more instructions and tells them, carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, et cetera, et cetera. And he gets down to the end of where he's giving them instructions. He says, "Do not move about from house to house. When you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you, cure the sick who are there, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you." So this was not just something special. that only he could do. This was something he expects all of us to be able to do. So I guess the only question we have to ask ourselves is, well, how? Right? The exact hows are probably the topic of a different talk for a different day. So stay tuned. But what I want to ask ourselves today is, okay, so I get it. Healing is a big part of who we are. It's a big part of our heritage as Christians, if we consider ourselves to be Christian. Some people in this room do and some don't. And quite frankly, I don't care what word you use as long as you love each other, right? But it's part of our heritage. And it certainly is part of our heritage in unity. I mean, it's how we got this thing started, okay? So then what we have to ask ourselves is, all right, what's the so what? What do we have to do differently or better as a church, as a group, as an organization? What changes do we have to make? What things do we have to do if we're really going to live this as a core value? So one of the things that occurred to me that it's a little difficult sometimes to do is we have to be willing to welcome people who need healing of all kinds, even when we're made uncomfortable by their unwholeness, right? And it's, sometimes we may feel a little ashamed to admit it, but we may feel uncomfortable around people who have an obvious physical issue. And we can be made very uncomfortable by people with mental issues. That's a normal reaction. Back in the day, when the Bible was written, they were extremely focused on the purity laws, right? Jesus talked about that and about the obsession that the church had come to have around people being whole and being pure in the parable that we talk about being the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? The thing is Jesus wasn't really trying to make a point about the Samaritan. If Jesus was going to put a title on that particular parable, he'd probably call it the parable of the bad rabbi, which kind of sounds like a movie production company, doesn't it? Bad Rabbi? Anyway. His point was that here's this guy who's traveling along the road minding his own business. He gets beat up and robbed and left for dead. You know? Along comes a priest from the temple, somebody that you ought to be able to count on to help you when you're down. What's he do? Goes over to the other side of the street so he doesn't risk getting dirty from that body laying over there. Along comes somebody else from the temple, right? One of the junior assistant types. What does he do? Goes to the other side of the street because he's afraid of getting his hands dirty. He's afraid of being soiled, afraid of becoming unclean, afraid of becoming unlike God. So what's this Samaritan do? Right? Samaritan comes along and he picks the guy up and binds his wounds, bathes him, pours wine on him. It's the best thing he had. Takes him to an inn and asks somebody else to take care of him and pays the money for it. Which is really more like what I would expect people who profess to be close to God to do. You know, Jesus' ministry was rife with examples of how he ministered to those people that were considered unclean. He not only regularly ate with people who were considered unclean, but he reached out his hands and touched them and healed many of them. Lepers, prostitutes, women who were bleeding, right? So many things that the religion of the day would not touch. He went ahead and did it. Now, I get that part of our fear, at least subconsciously, when we come across people who are not whole, is that maybe it's catching, or simply somehow, my God, that could be me. And so we're afraid. We're afraid of going there. But if we're going to say that healing is a core value for this congregation, then we have to be welcoming of people who come needing to be healed. And then the other thing we have to do is we have to be in complete acceptance if they are healed or not, and if they stay or not. I remember in Santa Barbara one time, I met this young man who had come in to Unity because he had been hurt by the church that he had been in before. And he had a wounded experience of Jesus and of God. And he was there every Sunday with his family, and he went to all the classes and all the workshops, and he was talking about maybe becoming a licensed Unity teacher, maybe even going to ministerial school. And then one week he wasn't there. And a few more weeks went by, he wasn't there. Christine ran into him a couple of months later, I think down at the farmer's market, and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And he said, "I'm doing great." So I went back to a traditional Christian church. My time with you guys healed my relationship with Jesus. Good. That's good. It would have been nice to have him around, but he got what he needed. He moved on. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are those people who don't heal and don't go away. And you know what? We have to love them just as much, because something in their soul is calling them to be here with us. Maybe the person who's going to help them heal hadn't walked through the doors yet. Maybe the thing they need to hear, hasn't occurred to somebody yet. Maybe the class that they need to take hasn't been written yet. But they're in the place they need to be. So if we're going to say, yes, we are a place of healing, then we have to expect a few sick. Right? In my other spiritual community, we like to say we're all sick. Some of us are just sicker than others. And we love everybody just the same. So another thing that's important for us as an institution is that we have to be willing to heal our institutional ills as well. If Christine and I had known, if we knew then what we know now about this church, if we'd have known everything that had happened when we got here 3 years ago, I think rather than immediately embarking on visioning, and finding a new vision, mission, and core values for the church, probably the first thing that we would have done would have been a deep healing process. I think that given all of the strife that happened in the couple of years following Jerry's death, for those of you who are new, that he was the minister who was here for 31 years. But given everything that had happened, perhaps we should have brought in someone and done some family systems work, and really invited those people who, used to be members of the church to at least come back and participate in that healing, so that we would have more of an institutionally sound basis to go from. But we didn't know that. So you can only do what you can do with, what you know when you know it. What I will say now today is we've done a bunch of work in the past 3 years. We've done work on prosperity. We've done work on our inner shadow. That entire last year of knowing that nothing and no one is against you. All the people who've been through the Q effect, right? We've been doing some pretty deep work to help us heal as a congregation. And we've got more to do, quite frankly. I think one of the most valuable things that we can learn as an organization, and this also counts in our individual lives, is how to communicate with one another in a compassionate or nonviolent fashion. Right? In other words, when we're feeling something, when rubbing against others has created friction, instead of taking that off someplace and stewing on it, or triangulating by talking to someone else, or simply taking our toys and going home, which has happened, we go to whatever that source is. And for many of you, that's me. And we simply say, Reverend Charles, when you said this, I felt whatever you felt. Right? And what I really need from you is this. Whether it's an apology or an explanation or change of heart, whatever you want. You ask for what you want. You say how you felt, not you made me blank, right? You see the difference in that? Right? We all own our own parts of it, whatever it might be. And from that honest dialogue, with each of us talking about what we own in it, we can start healing. And when we do that as part of the structure of this organization, the organization heals. Amen? All right. My door is always open, as long as I'm in the office. And the best way to find me is to make an appointment with me, right? Because I do a lot of stuff. But I am here for you, right? And I will tell you that, the other members of this congregation, if you give them a chance and just say, hey, when you did this, I felt like this, they'll listen to you. They'll listen to you. Sometimes it's scary. We got to put on our big boy and big girl pants. But it's worth it. It is so, so worth it. So, looking at that as an institution, then if we ask ourselves, what sort of things do we need to do as individuals? What actual actions do I need to take if I'm going to live up to the core value of healing? One of those is pretty simple, is simply making choices that are in alignment with that. Making choices focused on healing our bodies, our minds, and our spirits. Changing our thoughts, our words, and our actions to promote healing and not staying in dis-ease. Not staying in that victim mentality. Not continuing to live in the story of what's wrong, but transcending that and beginning to create that healing and wholeness. I tell you, just about any time you get a group of people with ARP cards together, what you're going to get is a discussion based on a litany of either what's wrong or what prescriptions we're taking to try to fix it. I'm not making this up. All right, some of you are guilty of this. You know you are, right? We sit there and we talk about, the last operation I had and, the current issue I've got going on and, I'm having this side effect, so they're going to try me on that. Our bodies are hearing that, right? Our bodies hear that. And when we continually think about the problem and we continually talk about the problem, what do you think we get? More problem. So when we, like Myrtle Fillmore and Charles and all the people who've done this, when we start focusing on the solution, and then taking actions based on that, right? Like I can't keep visualizing myself as a skinny guy and chowing down Texas sheet cake and expect to get thinner, right? Yeah, sorry. Yeah. It's funny. It's both my mother and my aunt were diabetic. Both of them, almost every time I went to visit them, had a Texas sheet cake. Direct correlation, right? Remember one time I showed up at my mom's house and said, Charles, you look like you put on some weight. And then literally the next thing out of her mouth was, hey, there's Texas sheet cake in the kitchen. Yeah, my mom was a pro enabler. I miss her. I miss her still. And her Texas sheet cake. It was pretty good stuff. But the idea is we need to make those choices both in our thoughts and in our actions that are in alignment with healing, not staying in the problem. All right? Now, this one's really kind of scary. And this has to do more with healing ourselves in spirit. When we are triggered by things, we need to be willing to look at what's triggering us, to follow that feeling into our subconscious and say, wow, how much of this is me? All of it. Right? It's all you. Okay? How many of you who are here today have been through the Q effect? Right? That is really awesome. All right? That is a system that in many ways teaches us to take a look when we're triggered and to go into our subconscious and figure out what's up and what's my piece in this. And I know many of you who've been through that and who've done the work and have done the sheets. Not only do you have stories to tell about how this works, but you now have a way of addressing things when they come up, right? You have a system, a process. You have a tool in your tool bag that works. And those are the kind of things that we want you to have. That's why we've done that workshop about 4 or 5 times here in the past year and change. Because until we address those things that we've buried in our subconscious, they will continue to be landmines in consciousness for us, and every once in a while, we or somebody else will step on them, and there will be an explosion until we dig them out. The last thing I want to mention is, as people who are part of a healing ministry, we need to be willing to be part of other people's healing. Sometimes that gets messy and uncomfortable, but sometimes it's the only thing that works, not just for them, but for us. From the time human beings first fermented grapes, there were people who would go off the deep end with it. Thousands of years, millions of lives. And it wasn't until in the last century when finally one drunk decided, you know what, I need to help somebody else, that they came up with a cure for alcoholism. 2 guys around a table in Akron, Ohio, figured that out, and they've changed a lot of lives since then, mine included. Very often, we can save a life. And very often that life that we save by helping someone else is our own. And if we're going to say we are a healing ministry, we have to remember that as well. So healing is both understanding and demonstrating the innate wholeness that is our birthright as children of a loving God. There are things that we do both as a community and as individuals that allow us to be in alignment with that and to live whole, which is the truth of who we all are. Please join me in prayer. Sweet Spirit, we give thanks today for that innate wholeness that we know in you, as you, and through you. We know that no matter what the fact is, whether we carry some dis-ease with us, whether we are challenged in any other way, physically, mentally, or spiritually, that the truth of who we are is whole and perfect. We are Christ, whole and perfect. And as we begin to know that at the deepest possible level, we are healed. We are free. And for that, We are deeply, deeply grateful. Thank you, sweet Spirit. So it is.